All right, so today we're going to dive into some global economics. Get ready, it's going to be a wild ride. We're going to be talking about the future of the EU. And then there's this radical new approach happening down in Argentina. Plus, we'll touch on some potential shockwaves that might hit the US financial system. Oh, and all of this is based on a conversation between like two experts that we're going to break down for you. So by the time you finish this deep dive, you'll be seeing like all the headlines with some fresh new perspective.
You know what's really fascinating is how all of these stories, they might seem kind of separate at first, but they're all actually connected. It's all part of this bigger picture, like the global economy is at a crossroads. It's a big deal.
Okay, so let's unpack all of this, right? Let's start with the European Union, the EU. Our experts, they kick things off with this like bold claim, right? They say the EU was actually designed to rip off the US. And this is coming from, get this, former President Trump. I've got to admit, I was kind of surprised by that. Is there any truth to that statement? Like, is the EU really trying to pull one over on us?
Honestly, not really. That claim, it's just not accurate. Factually, it doesn't hold up. See, the EU, it actually started way back in the 1950s. After World War II, European countries, they were looking for a way to team up, to work together on trading coal and steel. And from there, it just kind of grew, evolved over time, and eventually became this political and economic union that we know today.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's where things get interesting. So apparently the EU now has like 50,000 employees. 50,000! And they're all based in Brussels. What in the world are all those people doing over there? It just seems, I don't know, excessive, don't you think?
It definitely raises some questions. You got to wonder about efficiency, right, and bureaucracy. And if you look at the numbers, there are definitely signs that the EU is facing some serious challenges. Like, think about this. 25 years ago, Europe's GDP per capita, that's a measure of how much each person in the economy is producing. So their GDP per capita was pretty much on par with the United States. But today, it's only about 70% of the U.S. level.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So is all that bureaucracy actually holding them back?
Well, it's complicated. It's not a simple answer.
Yeah.
But some experts, they argue that, yeah, the way the EU is structured and their social welfare policies, they might be hindering economic growth. There's another concerning trend, too, like think about new businesses being created. There are way fewer new businesses popping up in Europe compared to the U.S. I mean, we've seen all these innovative companies emerge in the U.S., companies worth trillions of dollars. But Europe, they seem to be missing out on that kind of energy, that dynamism.
So if they're not like actively ripping off the US, why are they struggling so much? You'd think with 50,000 employees, someone could figure out some solutions, right?
Well, get this. Our experts actually suggest something pretty dramatic. They think that the EU might actually break up, like completely fall apart. And the euro, the currency they use, they say it could collapse. And all of this could lead to Europe becoming, as they put it, an economic backwater.
Wait, hold on. A breakup. That's a pretty bold prediction. What would that even look like? I mean, seriously, how would that impact like the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's definitely a scenario that's worth considering. Imagine, like, all these countries going their separate ways, each with their own currency and their own economic policies, and then all the trade relationships, they'd have to be completely renegotiated. And the financial markets, oh man, they'd be in for a wild ride. Plus, there's a real potential for political instability, too.
Okay, so things could get really messy in the EU. All right, so now let's shift gears a little bit and head south down to Argentina, where things are, well, they're heating up with their new president, Javier Milei. He's being called a radical. Some people even say he's like a South American version of Trump. He's shaking things up big time with all these economic reforms.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty fair comparison. Milei and Trump, they're both known for, doing things their own way. They don't really care about the status quo, and they're both willing to, challenge the system.
And he's definitely not wasting any time, this Milei guy. He's slashing costs and taxes, cutting regulations left and right. He's even promising to abolish the central bank. That's the institution that controls a country's money supply, right?
That's right. Milei, he's all about free markets, limited government, and abolishing the central bank. That's a pretty extreme move, even for him. He's definitely facing some pushback.
Yeah.
Our experts, they call it Argentina's deep state. Basically, it's all the people who benefit from the current system, and they're not going to give up their power easily.
Sounds kind of familiar, right? Like Trump battling the swamp in Washington. But wait, there's more. On top of all that, Argentina decided to ship its gold reserves to Europe, which just seems, I don't know, a little shady, right? And they're back to asking the IMF for more loans. Haven't they been down this road before?
Yeah, that gold shipment thing, it's a bit of a mystery. lots of speculation, but no one really knows for sure what's going on. Some people think it's a way to protect their assets, just in case things really fall apart.
Yeah.
But it also kind of signals a lack of faith in their own system, right? And as for the IMF loans, well, Argentina, they've got a long history of financial instability. They often need bailouts. It's kind of a pattern.
So what's the motivation behind like sending all their gold to Europe? And is it really a smart move, especially considering like their track record with the IMF? They haven't exactly been the best at managing their money in the past.
Well, that's the interesting part, right? Some experts, they suggest that Argentina is trying to safeguard their assets just in case things, really go south. But it could totally backfire. It might make investors even more nervous. Definitely a risky move.
It sounds like they're playing with fire down there. But this Milei guy, he clearly isn't afraid of taking risks. So what are the chances that he actually pulls this off, like abolishing the central bank? And what would that even mean for everyday Argentinians? Like, would they be better off, worse off?
Well, like we were saying, he's facing some serious opposition. There are powerful forces at play here who really benefit from keeping things the way they are. It's a real David versus Goliath situation.
Okay, so we've got this potential time bomb ticking away in the EU, and then there's Argentina making this high-stakes gamble. But wait, there's more. We've got another potential economic shakeup brewing, and this time, it's right here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. And this one involves a familiar face. You guessed it, Donald Trump. Our experts, they talk about something called the Mar-a-Lago Accord. It's this theoretical plan to devalue the U.S. dollar and completely reshape global trade. They're calling it a Trump reset for the global economy. And the mastermind behind it, none other than his advisor, Stephen Moore.
Okay, now things are getting interesting. A Trump reset. That sounds like it could have some major consequences, right? But before we dive into that, let's talk about why is the US dollar such a big deal in the global economy? It's just like a piece of paper, right?
It's a little more than that. See, the U.S. dollar, it's the world's reserve currency. That means it's used for almost all international trade and investments.
Yeah.
And that gives the U.S. a lot of power economically and politically. But with that power comes a lot of responsibility.
Right. So what would a Trump reset actually mean for the US and the rest of the world? We're talking about devaluing the dollar, which sounds like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it would be a major move. It has the potential to completely reshape global trade and financial markets. The idea is that it would make U.S. exports cheaper, more competitive, and then imports would become more expensive. They're hoping that this will reduce the U.S. trade deficit. Right now, it's sitting at $1 trillion every year.
$1 trillion. That's like a lot of money flowing out of the US. So devaluing the dollar would be like putting American goods on sale for the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It could boost U.S. manufacturing, create jobs, at least in theory. But of course, there are potential downsides too.
Like what? I mean, it can't all be good, right? What are some of the risks of messing with the value of the dollar?
Well, for one thing, it could lead to inflation. The cost of everything goes up. So everyday Americans, they could end up paying more for everything. I'm talking cars, coffee, groceries, everything.
Yikes, that doesn't sound good. So it sounds like it's kind of a gamble, right? There are some potential benefits, but also some serious risks. So what do our experts think about how likely is this Trump reset to actually happen?
They're actually divided on that. One expert thinks it's a real possibility, but the other one's more skeptical. He points out that, Trump's background is in real estate. He's not exactly an expert in national economic policy.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So we've got this potential upheaval in the EU. Then there's Argentina playing this high-stakes game. And now there's this Trump reset looming in the US. It feels like the whole global economy is teetering on the edge. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, it does feel like, we're at kind of a turning point. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, that's for sure. But I think, if we break things down a bit step by step, we can actually learn a lot from these different situations happening around the world.
Yeah, good idea. So let's try to dig a little deeper into this whole potential EU breakup thing, right? If this actually happened, if the EU just fell apart, what would it mean for everyday people living in Europe? I mean, what would it actually look like for them?
Well, think about it. If the euro collapses, right, all those different countries, they'd go back to using their own currencies. I mean, that alone would be a huge change. Prices would be fluctuating all over the place. Traveling between countries would get way more complicated, probably more expensive too. And businesses, forget about it. They'd be facing a whole new set of challenges. It'd be a massive adjustment for sure.
That's a pretty dramatic shift. So what about the impact on global trade. Would a weaker Europe, a fragmented Europe, would that change things for other big players like the US or China?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a weaker EU could definitely create opportunities for other countries to, kind of step in and fill the void
Hmm.
economically and politically. Think about trade deals, alliances, the whole global landscape could shift. It's a big deal.
So there's this like potential domino effect here. It's not just about Europe, it's about the whole interconnected system, right? Everything's tied together.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a giant puzzle. You change the shape of one piece, the whole picture gets messed up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, totally. Okay, so Europe's kind of a big question mark right now. Let's zoom back down to Argentina for a minute and talk about, their big gamble with Milei and all these radical reforms he's pushing. One thing that really jumped out at me, though, is that even though inflation has gone down in Argentina, consumer prices haven't really budged. What's up with that? Like, shouldn't things be getting cheaper?
Right. Yeah, that is kind of counterintuitive. You'd think that lower inflation would automatically mean like lower prices at the store, right?
Yeah.
But it's not always that simple. There are a few things that could be happening here.
Like, what? I mean, are Argentinian businesses just being greedy? Like, are they just holding out, hoping to rake in bigger profits while people are still struggling?
Well, it's possible. I mean, some businesses might be playing it safe.
Yeah.
They want to see if the lower inflation is going to stick around for a while before they start changing their prices. I mean, they could be worried that prices will shoot back up, so they're hesitant to, adjust things too quickly.
So it's like a wait and see approach. But wouldn't that be like super frustrating for everyday people in Argentina who are, still struggling with the high cost of living?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even though technically inflation is lower,
Hmm.
people aren't really feeling it in their wallets. It's like there's this disconnect between the economic data and, people's actual lived experience.
Yeah, I get that. Perception matters a lot, especially when it comes to how people feel about the economy.
Right. And if people don't feel like the economy is getting better, even if the numbers look good on paper, well, that can create a lot of instability, political instability. It can get messy.
Okay, so Argentina, it's a bit of a mixed bag right now. Lower inflation is good, but consumer prices haven't really caught up yet. All right, let's switch gears again and head back up to the US. I want to talk more about this Trump reset idea. Our experts, they mentioned something about the possibility of foreign exchange controls. So, like, the government making it harder to move money out of the country. How would they even do that? And what would that mean for, like regular people? Like, what are the implications of that?
Okay, so imagine this. The government starts setting limits on, how much money you can send overseas. Or they could start requiring, like, special permission for certain types of transactions. Basically, it would be a way to try and, like, trap money inside the U.S. economy, keep it from flowing out.
That sounds, I don't know, kind of intense. Would they really do something like that? I mean, that sounds pretty drastic. And what would it mean for like people who want to, invest in foreign markets or send money to family members who live in other countries?
Yeah, it's a controversial move for sure.
Mm.
It would definitely face pushback from businesses and, regular people. But in times of like real economic turmoil, sometimes governments, they do some pretty drastic things.
So it's a possibility then, like something we should at least be aware of. It sounds like this Trump reset, if it actually happens, it could have a lot of unintended consequences. And not just for the US, but for the whole global economy. It's like we were saying earlier, everything's connected.
Right, that's the thing. It's important to remember that economics, it's a really complex system, lots of interconnected parts. And anytime you make a big change, like devaluing the dollar, it can create these ripple effects that are like almost impossible to predict.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got the EU potentially on the verge of falling apart. We've got Argentina taking this huge gamble with their economy. And then we've got this Trump reset looming over the US, which could have major consequences for everyone. It's a lot to take in. So is there any way to like connect all these dots and see what the bigger picture is here? Is there some kind of like overarching trend emerging from all of this?
That's a great question. And it leads us to one of the most like intriguing insights from our experts.
So, okay, let me get this straight. We've got the EU, right? And they're like maybe on the verge of a total meltdown.
Right.
Then you've got Argentina down there doing their own thing, taking this huge risk with their economy. And then on top of all that, we've got this Trump reset thing hanging over the US, which, let's be honest, could have some pretty crazy consequences for, well, pretty much everyone. It's a lot to process, It's almost like, are all of these things actually connected somehow? Is there some kind of I don't know, some bigger trend playing out here, like something that ties all these things together?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it actually gets to the heart of, like, one of the most thought-provoking things our experts bring up. They're suggesting that, and this is big, they're suggesting that what we might be seeing right now is, well, the end of the American century. That whole period where the U.S. was, like, the dominant force in the global economy.
Well, hold on. The end of an era. That's a pretty big statement, isn't it? Like, what are they basing that on? I mean, the U.S. is still, the U.S. Right.
Well, think about it for a second. Like, the U.S. dollar, it's not the only game in town anymore. Other countries,
Hmm.
especially emerging economies, they're starting to flex their muscles. They're gaining power. And there's this growing feeling out there that, the old rules of globalization, the way things have been done for, like, decades, maybe you're not working anymore. Maybe it's time for a change.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how these things might be connected now. So, are we talking about like a power shift here? Are countries like China, are they going to step up and take on a bigger role, like a more dominant role in the global economy?
It's not just about China, though they're definitely a major player, that's for sure. It's more about, like, a multipolar world.
Hmm.
So instead of just one superpower calling all the shots, you've got multiple centers of power,
Mm.
multiple players vying for influence, both economically and politically. It's getting a lot more complicated out there.
So, instead of having one big boss, it's more like everyone's kind of in charge now. That sounds, I don't know, exciting, but also kind of scary, you know? Like a lot more unpredictable.
Exactly. I mean, there's definitely a lot of potential in a multipolar world,
Hmm.
tons of possibilities. But yeah, it's also a lot more uncertain. The old systems, the alliances, they're all being tested right now.
Mm.
And new ones are popping up all over the place. It's a very, dynamic situation. Things are changing fast.
So what does all this mean for, regular people like us, the people just trying to make sense of all this craziness? Like, what can we actually do to, I don't know, to prepare for this whole economic shakeup that might be coming?
Well, I think the most important thing is, like, adaptability. You got to be able to roll with the punches. Things are changing so quickly these days. We need to be flexible, open to new ways of doing business, new ways of investing, even new ways of thinking about our careers. The old ways, they might not cut it anymore.
Yeah, I get it. We can't just like stick our heads in the sand and pretend things aren't changing, right? We got to stay informed, stay adaptable, and maybe even get a little, adventurous, try some new things.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely a time for, like, caution, but also, time to take some calculated risks. You can't just sit on the sidelines and wait for things to happen. You got to be proactive.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap here. We started with the EU, maybe falling apart. Then we went down to Argentina with their radical economic experiment. And then we talked about this whole Trump reset thing in the US, which could really shake things up globally. And now we're talking about like the end of an era, the end of American dominance, and the rise of this multipolar world. I gotta say, my head's spinning a little bit. So if I had to like boil all of this down to one key takeaway, what would it be? What's the most important thing to remember from all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is simply that the global economy is in transition. That's the bottom line. The future, it's uncertain, no doubt about it, but it's also full of opportunities. So if we stay informed, if we think critically, if we're willing to adapt and change, well, we can navigate this whole thing. And who knows, maybe we'll even come out ahead in the end.
Well said. And that, folks, is our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's safe to say we've given you a lot to think about.
Yeah, and remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about all these forces that are shaping the global economy, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions. For yourselves, for your families, for your businesses, this stuff matters.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us on this wild ride. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged with the world around you. We'll see you back here soon for another deep dive.